So tonight's program is the second in our Voices for the Land online speaker series, which highlights perspectives from and about diverse communities and their relationships to the land. This theme is important to the work of our guest speaker tonight, Forrest King-Cortes, who is the Director of Community-Centered Conservation at the National Land Trust Alliance. Forrest's work centers on equity and prioritizes the creation of inclusive and inviting spaces and places. He has a degree in wildlife ecology and more than 10 years experience working toward people-centric and relationship-focused conservation at local, regional, and national scales. So Forrest will share more about the Land Trust Alliance, his work and his experience as a Latine conservationist. And I'm really grateful to have him here talking with us tonight.
As Carrie mentioned, my name's Forrest King-Cortes, and I work as the director of the Community-Centered Conservation Department at the Land Trust Alliance. And so I was at a presentation recently, and someone said, instead of an agenda, let's call it a trail map. So I'm gonna lift that here today, and our trail map for our time together is I'll share a little bit about myself and kind of what inspired me to work in the land conservation space and to work with communities. I'll go through a little bit of an overview of what a land trust is, just in case folks are still getting to know the work of land trusts. We have a great example of a land trust hosting us tonight, so hopefully you at least have some familiarity with the type of organization. I'll talk a little bit about the Land Trust Alliance, the organization that I work for, and also our Community-Centered Conservation Department and what we see as community-centered conservation and what that looks like. We'll take you on a little bit of a journey through some different community-centered conservation projects and partnerships across the country that will hopefully leave you feeling inspired and excited about the work that land trusts are doing in their communities. And I will say, since we are a smaller group today, I think maybe I'll pause it a couple moments to see if folks have questions, but also feel free to save your questions for the end or drop them in the chat and start a queue, and we'll get to them as soon as we can. So I think when I talk about my background, it's important to talk about where I'm from and where my family is from. I have family from both ancestrally from Europe and then also from Mexico, from the Michoacan region of Mexico. And so that means that my family and my ancestors are immigrants to this country, and we're on lands that are not our original homelands. And so I take that responsibility pretty seriously to be good stewards and caretakers and partners of the land that we're on. One thing that I hope you will leave with tonight is that I'm a huge nature nerd and a very emphatic birder and bird watcher. And so there'll be some photos of the work, of course, but I'm also hoping to wow you a little bit with some photos that I've taken here and there on some of my adventures. But one of the reasons that I pulled these photos up is a reminder that we're all from somewhere. And, you know, we have the places that we're from, and then we have the places that we live. And there's a lot of things that connect us between those different locations. And one of the things that always reminds me of the connection between different countries and different cultures are monarch butterflies. And the picture on the right is it was a tree full of monarch butterflies that I had the opportunity to see in Cleveland when I was taking a walk in a park after our conference a couple of weeks ago. And they were just covering the tree. And I just stopped for a minute and as I was pulling these slides together, wanted to pull that up as part of my story, right? Because we all have our migration stories. Many of us have moved somewhere, might be down the street, might be across the country, might be to another country. But animals have those stories too, and the landscapes that we share are full of those stories. Personally, I have lived predominantly in two places over the course of my life. I always say that Chicago is and will always be home. That's where I was born and raised in the city. And right now I currently reside in Birmingham, Alabama, which is where I relocated recently and also near where I went to college. So I have kind of two places that I call home, but most of my family is in Chicago, and both places are not necessarily places that people think of when they think of scenic landscapes, but they're beautiful, incredible landscapes full of biodiversity and amazing places to explore. And so on the left, you'll see a photo from the Chicago lakefront. We are really lucky to have one of the Great Lakes as our backyard, Lake Michigan. And the Park District has conserved thousands of acres of land not just for public parks and for ball fields and soccer fields, but also for biodiversity and recreation and just climate resilience across the city. And so we have this really beautiful network of green spaces across Chicago. And that's part of what growing up inspired me, even as a city kid, to really have a passion for the outdoors and to care about the green things living around me and to want to put my hands in the dirt and to want to know, what is that bird? What is that butterfly? And all of those types of things. And on the right, we have a photo of Birmingham, Alabama. This is Ruffner Mountain, which is a privately protected natural area by a nonprofit in the community. And it's a really beautiful view. Far off in the distance is the downtown skyline of Birmingham. It's a little tough to see in the photo, but when you're up there, you just get this breath of fresh air and you can see so far in every direction. And the site is actually a reminder of the different ways that people have impacted the landscape over the years, because it was formerly mined and then it was protected, and now it has trails and opportunities for families to engage. So I really like the space because it reminds us that we are so connected to the lands that we live and work and exist on. And there's many different ways that they impact us and that we can impact those lands. So these are some photos from different group outings over the years before I came to the Alliance. I would say that my career trajectory started as a little kid making mud soup in the backyard of my parents' backyard. I don't know if anyone else on here has ever made mud soup. It's not delicious, but it's really fun to make. You just throw everything from the backyard into a bucket and voila, then you still have to eat dinner because it's not very filling. But we were outside all the time. Like I think there's sometimes a misconception that cities don't have ways for people to experience nature, but I found that to be totally not the case. I grew up picking raspberries in my grandmother's backyard, helping to plant potted tomatoes in my other grandparents' house, and grew up really lucky to have this network of parks and green spaces that had free summer camps and opportunities to then become a camp counselor, and then to join volunteer restoration programs, and then to join paid restoration opportunities to help restore the land and care for the land. And so I have really benefited over the years from all of the different programs that invested in communities and that made it a point to create opportunities for kids, young people, young adults to be connected to nature and to build a career out of the outdoors, or just to build a passion for the outdoors. And so I had all that in mind. I had family camping trips in mind from when we would go over the border of Wisconsin to Mirror Lake State Park and Devil's Lake State Park, camping for the weekend in the fall as a kid. Fishing trips where my mom was actually teaching my dad how to fish, and really incredible stories from my dad, who didn't go to college, but instead actually went out west and worked for the Conservation Corps in a number of different national parks. And I don't think he was thinking of it at the time, but he was kind of groundbreaking, you know, to be a Mexican American guy working in conservation. He doesn't call himself a conservationist, but that was the work he did. He cleared snow from rooftops on Park Service buildings. He helped to keep roads clear and rode snowmobiles up and down to make sure that people weren't on the trails at closing and things like that in the winter. And so he brought those stories back of, like, you know, another city kid going out, experiencing these vast landscapes and getting to be a part of that. And he went on to be a firefighter, but he carried that with him, and he carried that inspiration into our family. And I think we all have a little bit of that conservation ethos because of our families. And so that's kind of why I started with ancestors and family, because I think it's really important that we remember we have an opportunity to influence everyone around us and to create really important connections. So these are some photos. I had all these volunteer and youth experiences, and then I went to college, studied wildlife ecology and management at Auburn University in Alabama. And it was just about as far as I could get away from home, because I wanted to try a totally different landscape. I wanted to try a different experience. And I went to school thinking, you know, I love growing up in the city. I want to go work in a woods or a prairie somewhere miles from a town and just be surrounded by birds and bees. And so I went through school with a pretty typical wildlife education, learning how to identify birds and fish, and learning about migration pathways and the history of land conservation in the US from a very I would say, narrow perspective, often not hearing about conservationists who looked like me or had experiences like me, but hearing about figures like Teddy Roosevelt and others that many of us may recognize. And I graduated and couldn't find a job. And so the closest I could get, which was actually a pretty important and good in a lot of ways job, was working at an animal shelter. And I was actually hired to start a volunteer and outreach program at an animal shelter in Birmingham, Alabama. And so that was kind of my first graduate experience. I'd had internships, I did some undergraduate research throughout college, but my path led me to just finding the best possible job that I could in the moment, because there weren't a lot of opportunities at the time when I graduated. And I really liked the work. It actually reminded me how much I love working with people and communities, and reminded me to think of communities as part of the solutions to the problems that we're facing, instead of just part of the problem. And so after a little bit in that work, I decided I wanted to try to get back into conservation. I missed my family, so I moved back to Chicago. And again, part of this story of like conservation happening in cities and cities being full of nature, I was able to find a job in Chicago working in conservation. And so I started out working with volunteers and community members to steward natural areas around the city, and learned really quickly, with a city as diverse as Chicago, that there were so many different ways that stewardship can take place, and so many different forms that it can take. It's not just about putting a plant in the ground, but can also just be about a family having a tradition of picnicking on Sundays in the park, or graduations or wedding receptions in the park, or going out and taking a walk quietly along the lakefront in the still hours of the morning and just enjoying the sounds. And that counts as stewardship too, because we're instilling in people a caring and nurturing feeling towards outdoor spaces and natural landscapes. That's really important. And so we worked really hard throughout the years that I was doing that work in communities to make sure that when we hosted events and when we built partnerships, we were responding to what communities wanted and how they wanted to connect with nature. And we were saying, you know what, this counts. We may not be removing invasive species, but this counts as stewardship, and this counts as loving your park in a good way. So it was really transformative for me along my journey to spend time in Chinatown in Chicago and get to understand the different cultural celebrations that take people outside, and the lunar cycles and why they're important, and what animals people resonate with, to go over to Mexican-American communities and be able to use some of the Spanish that I'd spoken at home growing up, and talking with people about birds over donuts and coffee in the morning, and getting to celebrate Dia de los Muertos and other important cultural moments, and heading to other communities in the city that were predominantly Black, and understanding how people like to use the parks there, and what it meant to be able to host family gatherings on the lakefront, and the history that had happened of exclusion in some of these spaces, and yet communities still wanting to be out in these spaces and still wanting to care for them. And so that was a lot of what inspired me to just really, I still love the wildlife ecology side of my background, but the people side of the work, the community side of the work, and building partnerships to do conservation work with communities, that's how I decided that's what I wanted to do. And so my path led me to the Land Trust Alliance just a few years ago to start our community-centered conservation department. And before I talk a little bit more about the work of the Land Trust Alliance, I do want to kind of give a little bit of an intro or a re-intro to this organizational structure, this community-based organization that is a land trust. And so, you know, we say all the time that communities are land trusts are community-based nonprofits that protect land, and they also help to bring benefit to communities. And so these organizations are actively managing, stewarding, restoring land, building partnerships with other organizations, with state, municipal, and federal agencies to get the work done, and with community members themselves to get them out to enjoy the land, to be a part of conservation. And all along this path, they're bringing benefit not just to the land, not just to the birds and the bees, but also to communities. And these may be nonprofit organizations, they may not be public parks or state parks, but these spaces provide incredible public benefit. So we say, you know, you sometimes hear people talking about private land conservation or nonprofit land conservation. And it's just important to understand the magnitude of what that means, because private land makes up 60% of the land cover in the United States. And right now, only about 3% of that is protected for conservation. So the other the other chunk of that is being used for other purposes that may be harming the land, maybe bringing some benefits to communities, but isn't helping us towards climate resilience, isn't helping us to clean our air, isn't helping us to protect important species or provide connection to nature. And so land trusts help to bring that number up and to ensure that it's not just about acres, but also about people. And land trusts are working in many communities. So land trusts work in 93% of US counties, and they're in urban, rural, and suburban areas and everything in between. Land trusts are protecting spaces you might even not realize. They're protecting waterways, parks, scenic views and overlooks, trails through cities, trails through different towns and countrysides, community gardens, preserves, and also culturally important sites, including Indigenous homelands and more. We're seeing a lot of Indigenous communities creating and moving forward the concept of native-led land trusts, which are helping to steward and reclaim and care for homelands. And they're integral parts of their communities. On the right, you see land trust staff, including, and some of our own staff actually went out for this, kind of rallying the conservation community to help clean up after the hurricane that hit Asheville and the surrounding communities just recently. And so land trusts are a part of these communities. The staff live and work in these communities. They see the day-to-day, they see the challenges and opportunities in their communities, and they're just deeply ingrained. And so Land Trust Alliance, then, we're an organization that supports the work of these community-based organizations. So we as a nonprofit, as a national organization, actually don't own or manage land directly ourselves. We support all of our members in doing that great work. And so our mission is to save the places that people need and love by strengthening land conservation across America. And we do that by investing in all of these other nonprofits that I just mentioned, these land trusts, their partners. We have over 950 members who are doing this work across the country, like I said, in 93% of US counties. And so we know that change is made by people, that conservation at its root is driven by people and always has been. And we're a national voice for conservation and ensuring that people understand why land conservation is important, that elected officials are helping to make policy decisions that positively impact communities and positively impact land conservation. And we are kind of this national voice that helps to make sure that people understand this work and understand the importance of land conservation because of the work that organizations like Kestrel Land Trust are doing on the ground, and because of the relationship that we have with these organizations. We hear their needs, we hear the needs of communities, and we bring that up and we help to elevate that. And we catalyze change by helping to train. We invest in leadership development, organizational development, trainings, conferences, opportunities for land trust staff from across the country to connect and get to know one another and share experiences. And that's kind of our role. We see ourselves as a convener of land trusts and their partners, and also a driver to help ensure that land conservation work is happening in the best possible way and the most impactful possible way. And so together, all of these land trusts have protected over 61 million acres of land. And that number shocked me when I first heard it. It's a ton of land. It's a lot of land that's being protected. Those waterways, trailways, prairies, woodlands, deserts, all kinds of habitats and spaces that people and wildlife and plants and our landscapes need. And not that it's a competition, but this is more land collectively than the National Park Service. So if it puts it into context, and there's another conversion, it's like tons and tons of football fields. So if anyone wants to do the math in the chat on that, it's also a lot of football fields. But I find it more helpful to think of it in terms of just like how it relates to the overall size of some other protected areas in our country. And so that's a number that was as of 2020 census. We do a census with our members to kind of understand what they're working on and what the trends are. And so I actually have a feeling that we're further along than that at this point. And like I said, land trusts are hubs for community. And so there's over 16.7 million visitors to land trusts a year as of 2020. And so that's doubled because people are getting to understand the value of these spaces, and land trusts are working hard to build relationships in community and to think more expansively and inclusively about engagement. And so a couple quick more stats for those of you who are numbers folks. We'll have some photos and some stories later too, if that's how you learn. But Land trusts, 80% of land trusts provide opportunities to recreate and recharge. 6.4 million people who participated in land trust programs and activities in 2020. So those are youth programs, volunteer stewardship, recreation, opportunities for celebrating culture and community in land trust protected areas. And over 1.2 million acres of land trust properties are open to the public. So not every land trust property is open to the public. Some are protected and can't handle, they may be sensitive ecologically and they can't handle a ton of visitor traffic. But increasingly, land trusts are finding ways to make sure that people are still able to connect with all of the properties that they help to conserve. And sometimes that just takes place in different ways. And over 9,000 miles of trails are available across the country through the work of land trusts. And over 900 of those that we know of are designated for universal access. And so again, these are numbers from 2020. We're going through the process of getting updated data that happens every several years, but it gives you an idea of the magnitude of work of our sector and the work that we've been able to do by coming together with support from our organization at the Land Trust Alliance, but also just with land trust sharing information across themselves and being able to learn from one another. I may pause for a second before I move into the next section, since we can be a conversational group, and see if this has sparked any questions for people. Don't be shy. Please use the chat and we'll catch them as they come in. So next, I want to talk a little bit about, the Land Trust Alliance has a lot of different departments that focus on different things. So we have staff that are based regionally in different parts of the country, and they are boots on the ground. They know our land trust members in a specific region incredibly well. They understand the unique challenges of that region, the landscapes, the communities that are based in those regions. And they're often the first phone call or email that land trusts make when they have a question, when they want to share some knowledge, when they're working on a challenging issue. And those regions are all over the country. So we have like staff in the Southeast, we have staff in New England that interact with Carrie and her team all the time. And we have staff based regionally that are well-versed in all aspects of land trust work and land conservation. And then we also have staff who are like myself and some of my colleagues based nationally. And we work across all of the regions in partnership with our regional staff to advance different topics. And so we have staff focused on climate change. And then we have this department, which is near and dear to my heart, our community-centered conservation department. And so here you see myself and my colleague Asia. We're a mighty team of two, and yet we're able to do a lot thanks to the work of our regional staff, who are kind of like helping us to understand what different areas need across the country. And in the photo here, you see our new CEO, Ashley Demosthenes, who has been just wonderful to bring into the Alliance. She comes from a background of running a land trust and working for land trusts, and just really gets the work and really appreciates the people side of our work. So I wanted to kind of share how we define community-centered conservation, and I'm a super visual person, so you may have to bear with me with a little bit of an analogy here. I'm also from Illinois, like I said, so that's a prairie state, and so I did not use a tree for this metaphor. I used prairie flowers, and a dear friend actually drew this diagram for me. But we see community-centered conservation as tending to the whole plant, right? So on one side of the plant, you see the things that are super visible. You see events, programs, partnerships happening in communities on land trust conserved lands. And then below the surface, there's actually a lot of things that people don't realize go into community-centered conservation. It's all about trust building, partnership building, sharing resources, doing fundraising work together, sharing decision-making, and deciding how are we going to chart a path forward together. And that's the work that often doesn't make the headlines, but is really important to the work of community partnerships or community-centered conservation. So again, we see it as more than just programs and events. We see it as tending to that whole plant. And so, to take the metaphor a little further, we definitely see community-centered conservation as a way to approach land conservation that doesn't put that work in a bubble that exists outside of communities, but actually roots it in all of the other things that are happening within communities. People's need to exercise, people's need for health and well-being, people's need to be together and celebrate community and culture and find meaningful connections to one another and their environment. And so when we think about conservation in that way, it helps to remind us that the work of conservation is not just about acres and plants and birds and bees, but is actually about people and the challenges and opportunities that people face as well. And something that's really important to our department and our organization is, just as diversity in an ecosystem is really important and leads to healthy, vibrant, resilient ecosystems, that's true in conservation work too. So honoring the diverse communities that contribute to conservation, ensuring that we're partnering with folks that represent all communities across the country. These are really important aspects of community-centered conservation work. And that goes along with just knowing who's in your community, who are your neighbors, who have you not talked to before. And when we work in this way, we're really thinking about conservation as not just a charity. It can be, but also a symbiotic relationship where we're getting a lot of benefit from the work that we're doing on conserved lands, and communities are getting benefit from partnering with us. And we're not just extracting, but we're also giving back to that system. And so our department does a lot of the things that the Land Trust Alliance as a whole does. Like I said, we have training, we have grant programs, we convene peer groups and in-person gatherings for sharing knowledge and information. And we have some specific themes that come up in our work because as you can imagine, community-based work, community-centered conservation can entail a lot of different things. And it's totally context dependent. What Kestrel Land Trust is working on may be very different than what a Gulf Coast land trust in Florida needs to work on, or a land trust working in the redwoods of California may be working on. And that's true about the community-based work too, not just the conservation restoration side of the work. But our themes that we really focus on are leadership and organizational development and planning. So just helping land trusts think about how they integrate community-centered thinking and planning into their work. How do they train up the next generation of conservationists to be working in this way, to be partnering with communities. And then we also really are trying to uplift the role of history and culture in conservation. So I started this talk talking about my own history, a little bit about my own cultures, but I really think that in our department and our organization thinks that it's incredibly important for land conservationists, and actually for all of us who have a stake or an interest in land conservation, to understand the history of the land that we're on and the history of how we got to where we are today. And there's a lot of positive success stories over the years that often go untold about the ways that communities have protected land, from community gardens to family farms to family ranches to culturally important land. And then there's also some history that's hard to grapple with and can be hard to hear, but is true and is honest and is part of the story of how we got to where we are today. Discriminatory lending practices, removal of indigenous communities from land, and other things that have shaped right now who has access to land, who doesn't, and yet who still has relationships and wants to be connected to land. We also are thinking a lot about how we help land conservation organizations work with other sectors and movements. So I'll talk a little bit later about how land trusts are thinking about affordable housing needs in their communities. How are land trusts working with health-based organizations and organizations working with new citizens who have just come to this country and who have just immigrated to this country, and a whole bunch of other movements and sectors that are really important to the fabric of our communities that land trust should be at least thinking about and coordinating with. It doesn't mean we have to be working in every single topic area, but it is important to be coordinated. It is important to be aware and to be partnering where possible. And then our department also is really focused on uplifting the role of first stewards, the indigenous communities and tribes who have stewarded the lands and waters we're on for generations and since time immemorial. And so we want to both directly support indigenous-led land conservation, especially indigenous land trusts, and help our members to better partner with tribes and indigenous organizations to help restore connections to land, to help regain access to homelands that tribes and communities may not have, and to just facilitate more cultural understanding and trust building and relationship building. And then also we're really learning a lot about the role that land trusts can play in disability access, inclusion, and leadership. And there's a lot of very visible ways that this can take place, like increasing community access to trails and facilities, and ensuring universal access to programs, and having the right gear and the right facilities for people to be able to experience nature. But there's also, again, that quiet work, the roots from my metaphor of building relationships and ensuring that people with disabilities are part of helping to shape the future of land conservation, as well as benefiting from programs and events. Let me check the chat really quickly. Okay, I'm going to come back to that one at the end. That's a good question, Sue. So community-centered conservation in action. So now for the story aficionados, the visual storytellers in our group, I'm going to take you all through some examples. I've talked about what land trusts are. I've talked about what the Land Trust Alliance does to support this incredible community of organizations. And now I want to show you some examples of what this work really looks like on the ground. What does community-centered conservation actually mean in a program? And I will say, just shout out to Kestrel, you all are doing incredible community-centered conservation work. So I do hope that folks will spend some time on Kestrel's website and attending more events and programs, because they are a beacon of light in our community for what community-based work can look like. But I'm going to take us around the country to a few different places and then wrap us up with some closing thoughts as well, and then we can get into discussion. If I can get my notes to work. So that bucket of work that I called community-centered leadership and organizational development, at the Alliance, that's really important to us. We care deeply about ensuring not just that land is protected, but that we have the capacity, the expertise, the diverse leadership of people that's needed to make sure that we're ready for protecting this land and helping to benefit communities forever. This is like we want these conserved spaces to last into perpetuity through many generations. And to do that, we have to invest in the next generation. So one example of how we do that is our Scholars for Conservation Leadership program. It's a career development program for students who are just going into their senior year of undergrad. And it's students who are interested in conservation or natural resource management or some sort of facet of environmental and land nexus. And these are incredibly brilliant students selected from across the country. And what they get to do is they get to come together as a cohort through some really generous funding that we have and come to our big conference that we host every year, Rally, the National Land Conservation Conference. And this is full of professionals from different federal agencies, state agencies, from the private sector, from land trust work, from universities. And it's an incredible networking opportunity for young people to be a part of this program, to see one another as leaders and to learn from one another, but also to be mentored by experts in the sector who have similar shared interests or experiences or backgrounds, and can tell them a little bit about what it's like to work in the sector and give them a little bit of advice and support as they continue on their learning and work journey. And then at the end of the program, we actually host a number of different virtual seminars, which help the students prepare their resumes, help them understand what it means to serve on a nonprofit board and how it can be an important career boosting opportunity, how to do interviews, and all kinds of things that will help them get those technical and relational skills ready for entering into the workforce. And then the students actually all apply for the opportunity to be fellows with the program. And so then we will select usually 1 to 2 paid fellows from this cohort each year, and they'll be placed with a land trust somewhere across the country doing land conservation work in real time for a full year with a full salary, and will come out of that experience not just having helped to advance land conservation in a community and an ecosystem, but also with a ton of new professional skills and networks that can help get them ready for whatever's next, whether it's grad school or law school or moving right into a paid position somewhere else. We've had scholars placed in Oregon, Florida, and our most recent scholar has just actually moved from her fellowship program into a permanent position with the Trust for Public Land, working on developing green indigenous schoolyards on tribal lands. And so doing really incredible community work that's also helping with climate resilience in these communities, that's also helping to bring back native habitats and ecosystems to those spaces. And she's not just like growing and learning, but she's really bringing a lot to the organization. An example of the work that we do on the history and culture side of things, we've been doing a lot of training with land trusts and partners and consulting partners to help unpack the history, at least like a survey level 101 level history of land in this country. And you know, what do we need to understand as land conservationists or as just residents in this country about how we got to where we are today to be able to have private land conserved or to be able to, you know, enjoy a trail on the land. And so this started with some online module development. We worked with some consulting partners and some content experts and a group of land trusts out in Colorado to test run a new training that would help land trusts understand a little bit more about the ways that Indigenous and Black communities specifically have experienced the land throughout generations and continue to experience and be a part of conservation today. And that actually resulted after that program of bringing folks together and getting the content right into 2 online free self-paced learning modules where land trusts can actually go online and learn about different decades and important time periods and events throughout history that have shaped land conservation as we know it today and have shaped communities as we see them today. So things from, Black land ownership increases, in the 50s and 60s, and redlining, which helped to shape where communities can move and who can live where in different parts of cities, and many other topics that land trusts should be aware of as they do their conservation work. And so that's what that can look like for us at the national level, this work. When we talk about history and culture at the local level, I had the opportunity to visit Para la Naturaleza, which is a Puerto Rican land trust, a couple of years ago. And they, like many land trusts, don't just own tracts of land without buildings on them. They actually own some really important historical sites on the island. And one of those sites is Hacienda La Esperanza, which is a former sugar plantation. And so, as you might imagine, that land being protected is really important. It's a large piece of land. It's full of native species. It's full of history, and it's important to the community. It has, structures that have been on that land for generations. It has plant species that have been on that land for even longer. And at the same time, it has a really troubled history as a site where enslaved people were forced to work on the land and were forced to shape the land to become what it is today. And so the Land Trust has actually done a really great job of helping to uplift those stories and tell that story in an honest but important way through different art installations and exhibits at the building on the site. And so it was really powerful to walk around and not just hear about the ecology and the restoration and to be able to see the species on the site, and not just to hear about what was produced when it was a sugar plantation, but also to hear about the people who were living their entire lives as enslaved people on that land, and some of the ways that they resisted that. And so what you see on the left is a textile that an artist actually printed. There were people who escaped, enslaved people who escaped from the plantation and were able to tell their stories and file formal complaints that helped to change the trajectory of getting slavery abolished in Puerto Rico. And so it was really powerful to see these written words of really incredibly brave people who had escaped really difficult lives, going and helping to change the future by filing formal complaints, by telling people what was happening on these plantations. And this artist's work kind of commemorates those leaders that changed the future for future generations. And on the right, you can see some of the implements that were used, not just to harvest crops, but also to harm people on the site. And so it can be difficult to reckon with this history, but this is a way that a land trust is protecting land and also telling honest and true stories about history and culture that have paved the way for where we are today. Indigenous land relationships is another area that I mentioned we're working on as the Land Trust Alliance. We have not historically had a lot of work in this space, to be frank. And there have been a number of really incredible Indigenous land trust leaders who have come to us and said, hey, we want to work with you. We want to partner with you. We think that you could be doing more to support Indigenous land relationships and helping to reconnect Indigenous communities to land and helping people to reclaim homelands and culturally important sites and practice their cultural practices on the land that their family and their ancestors have lived on. And so we take that responsibility pretty seriously. And like everything we do this work in partnership. And so we've been really honored to be able to convene 2 Indigenous land conservation summits that have brought together people from all different tribal nations, from Hawaii to federally recognized tribes, to unrecognized tribes, to relationally recognized tribes, together to talk about their work to conserve land and to have Indigenous land trust leaders talk about how land trust organizations can protect and steward land, not just for nature's sake, but also for Indigenous communities. And we're about to host our third ever Indigenous Land Conservation Summit in Denver in 2026 in conjunction with our conference. And that space coming together in that way in person has really been not just powerful for the attendees to share experiences, to share knowledge and practices and best practices, but for the Alliance to learn what this work really means, and for all of us as individuals to understand how we can be allies in this work. And so we were honored to partner with Native Land Conservancy out of Mashpee, Massachusetts, and Tahoma Peak Solutions out of the Pacific Northwest, an Indigenous-led consulting firm, on a report that recently came out that highlights the different ways that land trusts are partnering with tribes and Indigenous communities to restore access to homelands. And so my next story is one of the case studies in there. This is a little bit of a shameless plug to go check out that resource, but also a really great story out of Colorado. It's a partnership between Montezuma Land Conservancy and the Ute Mountain Ute Tribe, where they have actually joined together to develop a new cultural harvest program that brings people from across many generations of the tribe, elders, parents, youth, and everyone in between, to reconnect with really important medicinal and first food plants that are on lands that are conserved by the Land Conservancy and that the tribe previously didn't have access to get onto and to harvest from. And so they've been able to build a really incredible partnership that advances land conservation by getting more people connected to the work of the Conservancy and by helping to restore traditional harvest and stewardship methods to the land, but also benefits the Ute Mountain Ute tribal citizens by getting them reconnected to plant relatives and to one another out on ancestral homelands. And it's really incredible to hear these partners speak about their work. They have not just worked on this program, but have really just dedicated their time to getting to know one another and understanding each other's cultural practices. And one of the things that they've done that I think is really incredible is they actually have a Ute Mountain Ute tribal citizen on their staff who's leading community engagement efforts, leading this program work. And her name's Regina, she's awesome. But I think really embedding community members in the staff of land trusts, in the board of land trusts, is a really great way for communities to have a stake in the future of the work of land conservancies and land trusts. So as I mentioned before, cross-sector collaboration, like cross-movement collaboration, that can mean many different things, right? That can mean working with social justice organizations, working with health organizations. Here I'm highlighting some of our work nationally to support land trusts in partnering to advance affordable housing and land conservation in coordination. And this is really important work. I don't know how many people realize this, but every state in the country has an affordable housing crisis. The degree to which inaffordability is affecting communities is different across different cities and regions, but every single state in the country has a deficit of affordable housing, both on the rental side and on the purchase side. And so what that means is that sometimes people can't even afford to live next to green spaces that are beautiful and important to them. Sometimes people can't even live in the communities where they're working to restore those green spaces for a land trust. And so land trusts, especially in the last several years, have really been asking the question of how can we coordinate better with organizations that are focused on affordable housing, that are focused on bringing this benefit to communities. We don't have to do it all ourselves. And I think that's a really important piece of cross-sector collaboration. It's about the partnership. Doesn't mean that land trusts are suddenly going to be doing it all on their own, but there's some really great stories that we've helped to uplift in a report a couple of years ago called Breaking Ground, where land trusts are partnering to advance affordable housing in their communities, or sometimes to just sit down at a coordinating table and say, here's some sites we want to protect for the purpose of conservation. What are the sites that you want to protect for the purpose of affordable housing? And how can we come together to plan a little bit more regionally, a little bit more comprehensively to accomplish both of our goals? And in some cases, they're even talking about building projects together. How can we ensure that affordable housing sites are climate resilient and that they're green and beautiful and also helpful to pollinators? And so those are some ways that this is taking shape across the country. And it's not just an urban issue, it's not just a rural issue. This is something that affects many communities across the country, like I said, in every state. So we've been able to partner with some national organizations like the Center for Community Progress which is really focused on community development and supporting land banks. And we created a shared service map. And we said, here's where our members as land trusts are working. Where are your members as land banks and affordable housing organizations working? And how can we put them in touch with one another? And how can they see themselves visually on a map and get inspired to collaborate and see some inspiration from this report? So that's the way that we're kind of walking the walk. Like I said, when we tell land trusts that they should be partnering to advance community-centered conservation, we need to be partnering too at the national level with partners doing other work in the same way. And so the story I'll tell you all here is out of Sandpoint, Idaho, and it's about Conixu Land Trust. And there's actually a few different partners that have been working with them on this project, but one of the main partners is the Bonner Community Housing Agency, and they serve the county that this project takes place in. So Conixu Land Trust is actually, has been on the cutting edge of this work for a number of years now. They realized in their community that their own staff were having to commute further and further to come into the office, that people were having to move further and further out from the town center to be able to afford somewhere to live, to rent, or to buy. And they started to realize, hey, this isn't just an affordable housing, a people problem, but this is a climate problem. People are driving, it's more traffic on the road, it's more paved surfaces that are plowing over something that could be a prairie or a grassland or a wetland. And we want to work with some partners to think about how do we find a more sustainable path forward, and also how do we support our community and being able to live in a place that's really meaningful to them, where they have their family, where they have their friends, and where they have their jobs in a close place. And so the Land Trust is actually able to work with partners to develop permanent affordable housing units that allow people to be closer to jobs, closer to green spaces, and really brought them into a totally new conversation. And again, it's not necessarily that the Land Trust went and did it all themselves, but they partnered with these organizations that are focused on housing. They partnered with real estate organizations, and they said, how can we confront this challenge together to help our communities and also help ourselves in the long run? So the next topic that I'll talk about is how nationally we're supporting disability access, inclusion, and leadership. And it can feel like a mouthful to have all those words in the title, but they all mean different things, right? To be able to access a site, depending on your mobility status or your level of vision, is very different than being a leader in planning the future of land conservation, or being a leader on an organizational board, or being asked, hey, what's your vision for this site? And so we have all these words on here, and it can be a mouthful, but they all do mean different things. And so that's why we've chosen these words as the header. This has been a topic that colleagues before myself and Asia have worked on at the Land Trust Alliance. A few years ago, Mary Kay O'Donnell, our Midwest program manager, worked with the organization and some partners on a guide for land trusts to be able to increase accessibility and inclusion of their facilities, of their programs, of their practices, for staff and community members to be more connected, regardless of ability, to the work of land trusts. And so that was another kind of publication that came out of our organization. And my colleague Asia and I recently just launched a new partnership a couple of years ago with an organization called Disabled Hikers, which is a disabled-run organization that is really focused on helping to ensure that people with disabilities are centered and leading the way in land conservation and outdoor recreation. And so we worked together with Disabled Hikers on a national grant program and learning cohort that brought land trusts together from all over the country, provided them with some funding to help build partnerships with disability organizations or community members in their neighborhood, and then brought people together regularly to talk about the challenges and opportunities and success stories that they were seeing in their work, with expert facilitation from Disabled Hikers and our Disability Council at the Land Trust Alliance, kind of weighing in as mentors, as coaches about how to do this work, how to get their staff ready to do this work, how to get community members aware, where to find disability partners. And at the local level, what this can look like is a partnership between Mohonk Preserve and SOAR Experiences in New York. And they're actually one of our grantees to the program we ran with Disabled Hikers. And what they were able to do was secure access to equipment that allowed people of all abilities to get on trails, as you see in these photos, and to access the beautiful preserves that Mohonk has protected, and to be together in community. And then they also partnered with some other organizations that were more focused on universal climbing programming. And so they have some really cool rock climbing sites that they protect as a conservancy. And they were able to partner with organizations led by people and serving people with disabilities to ensure that their climbing programs were accessible to more members of their community. So not just getting on the trails, but also getting on the rock walls, getting off the ground. And it was a really inspiring story. And they've learned a lot through their partnership. And we've learned a lot too as an organization by seeing how this work can evolve on the ground. Okay, we're almost ready for discussion time, but I did want to share a couple more thoughts. I have been, frankly, on the road the last couple of weeks, starting with our conference in Cleveland, Rally, the National Land Conservation Conference, and then followed by attending the National Land Bank Conference, talking about reclaiming vacant lands in Detroit, and then followed by the Latin American Voluntary Land Conservation Conference in Panama City, Panama. And it's been incredible. I'm actually zooming into you all right now from Denver for the last bit of travel for a while. We're here scouting the location for our next Land Trust Alliance conference in 2026. But I've really been reflecting on our role right now in this moment as people who care about land conservation, as people who exist in communities that are full of diversity, and whether you can see that diversity or not, it's there. And some of the things that I've really thought about are the ways that nature brings people together. I shared a little bit about my story about how we share migration pathways with different species, and how I can go from Chicago to Colorado and see a prickly pear cactus. And it's not the exact same prickly pear cactus as we have back home, but there's that connection, there's that memory of a species that, hey, I recognize we have these in the dunes back on the lakefront. And isn't it so cool that here it is out here on land where bison roam, and in a completely different context. And so nature connects us. And I think that sometimes we forget that we're part of not just like a large natural community and these large landscapes and ecosystems, but we're also part of a global community of people. And so when I was in Cleveland for our land conservation conference, one of our really amazing partners is Native Americans in Philanthropy, and they're actually partnering with us to host a virtual peer network for Indigenous land conservationists and Indigenous land trusts, and helping us to plan for our next Indigenous Land Conservation Summit in Denver next year. And we hosted with some of the other women in this photo from the Mending Mountains Collective just a dinner and welcome for tribal leaders and Indigenous land trust leaders from across the country in Cleveland. And one of the things that I was just reminded of time and time again is that we're all related, right? Just like the prickly pear here in Colorado is related to the prickly pear in Chicago, we're all related in different ways. And we all have shared history on the land, and the land holds all that history for all of us. And some people's histories are different than mine or yours, but they're no less important to understand in order to move land conservation forward. And then I'll share one more piece of wisdom from this group. Native Americans in Philanthropy has really been reminding people right now that, you know, their communities think in terms of generations. They are thinking about, in 7 generations, what legacy have we left for our relatives that are to come? And once we become ancestors and we've passed on, what are we leaving for the next 7 generations? And how can we set ourselves up to be thinking in that way? And so their mantra over the last several months that I've heard them say in different spaces has been, we need to be thinking in terms of generations, not administrations. So there's always unique challenges that face us in land conservation, but we can't get stuck in just the challenges. We need to be thinking in terms of generations, thinking about that next 7 generations, the next 2 generations even. And then from my experience in Panama, being surrounded by other amazing Latine, Latino, Latina conservationists, was a reminder that the work of land conservation is not just happening at Kestrel Land Trust. It's not just happening at the Freshwater Land Trust in Birmingham, where I live. It's not just happening at the Land Trust Alliance level across the US. There's private land conservation happening. We had 15 different countries represented when we were in Panama together, including the US, actually 16, including the US. And there's private land conservation, in addition to the work of public land conservation, happening in all of those countries, right? So from Brazil to Peru to Mexico to Guatemala to Venezuela. And all of these countries are going through their own going through what will eventually be history, right? Their own moments, their own challenges, their own exciting opportunities, as we are. And yet we can all come together in a room, and we can share stories about the work of land conservation, and we can learn from one another. And then when we go back home, we can remind ourselves, and I hope that I'm able to help remind you all as people who care about land conservation, that we're part of this bigger network. We're part of this bigger family of relatives across the country who are working towards shared goals. They're focused on acres, they're focused on communities, they're focused on livelihoods and ensuring sustainable forestry practices and family farms. And those are things that we do here too. And so it was really cool, just like that little prickly pear story that I shared between Chicago and Colorado. There's threads of shared experience across all of us. And like I said, we're all related. So, you know, in times like this, it can be difficult to remember that we have these connections to these faraway places. And in the day-to-day, when we're all really busy, it can be hard to look up and think about, gosh, outside of my work here today, how am I a part of the bigger picture? But it's happening. And so I just wanted to leave you all with that little bit of inspiration. And of course, yes, a few more photos. And then we'll open the floor for questions. But I just want to say thank you to Kestrel for having us. Carrie, thank you to you and Marilyn for being really incredible planning partners to get this to happen. And thank you all who joined us tonight. And let's open up the floor. And Sue, I might take your question first from the chat.
That would
Did you
be
want to add to it?
awesome.
Not mute.
Yeah, and I love that you mentioned that people think of their plant relatives in the indigenous communities, because I think my question in the chat is, do you track or discuss land preserved as wilderness, meaning roadless, not really managed for human use, but only for habitat where absolutely necessary? And the reason I ask that is I'm a little more pessimistic than you are, in that I don't think we've made a really important cultural shift, at least here in the US, where we think of the entire ecosystem as being valuable. I think we tend to think about a charismatic creature or a human use, and as a result, I don't think we always are looking at how we can preserve so much of what we don't yet understand in the ecosystem, and understand that in our participating or interacting with the ecosystem, we may be damaging the thing that we are learning to love before we fully understand it. And so while I fully support lots of land being available so that the community can, we only protect what we love. So everybody has to learn, you know, and benefit from the physical and mental privilege and health benefits of being exposed to the natural world. But I just worry, and therefore think about, as E.O. Wilson did, how, you know, maybe we need to preserve some land that isn't specifically for human use.
Yeah. I mean, that's something we think about a lot, and something that our members think about a lot. And so kind of starting off, I am definitely on the side of the spectrum of just thinking about ourselves as part of the ecosystem. And so I do think, like, I think there is a both and scenario. And no, I don't know if we've got it exactly right yet. And I don't think that we're quite at the finish line of that work yet, but I think it's ever evolving. And so I shared an overall number of land conserved by our members of 61 million acres, roughly, as of 2020. And I think the rough estimate of how much of that 61 million acres is open to the public is 1.2 million acres. So again, these are 2020 data. These are rough estimates from a sample size, not a full, you know, every land trust count of every property, but it gives us an idea of, you know, how much land is open to recreation. And then there's always a little bit of variation in how people interpret those kinds of questions on a survey, right? Like, what does open to the public mean? Like, is it open for a program once a year? Does it have a trail through it that's universal access? Is it only open to people participating in paid programs? Those numbers don't give us that kind of insight, but that spectrum is out there. So access and recreation can mean a lot of different things, and open to the public can mean a lot of different things. And I'll also share that that 61 million acres isn't just land that's just preserved and owned and managed directly by land trusts. That's also land that land trusts have worked with private landowners, ranchers, farmers, folks who own, significant amounts of acres, to put conservation easements or to help protect land and say, hey, we're going to enter into an agreement with the land trust to not develop this land, and we'll maintain it for habitat benefits. So that number is not just like what people might think of as preserves that a land trust literally owns and manages, but is also land that they've conserved in partnership with different entities over the years. So I think, there's a lot to your question. My last little piece of it would be, I think that's why it's so important to, not just conserve as much land as we can, but to do so in a really thoughtful way with people that know the land best and have known the land in different ways, maybe through different generations and as Indigenous people in some cases, because we don't always know what we're missing. Like land trusts have a ton of expertise. We all go through different types of schooling and lived experience that help prepare us for this work, but sometimes communities know best, and they know what's on that land before we've even realized it. And they may know what's really important to protect in their neighborhood. And they may actually understand that, hey, this sensitive bog with really endangered orchids, we don't want people trampling all over that. But we could put a nature play space a few spots down where it's mostly, an old gravel lot from someone that started to build something and didn't ever finish it. So I think those kinds of conversations are things that land trusts engage in every day. And we try to support our members in taking the liberty that they need to do land conservation in the way that works best for their communities and their habitats that they're working on. So we try not to be prescriptive, but there's a lot that has to happen at the land trust level for this balance to be struck.
I understand that, but you don't track sort of those finer subcategories in your data, at least not yet.
We
in
don't
terms
have,
of
I
how the
don't,
land
yeah, I
is-
don't have access to like a rolled up number, but our accredited members have to do pretty rigorous monitoring of the lands that they conserve. And so I would say that each member probably has that number right at the front of their mind, or at least somewhere filed away, but we don't have that. I don't have that rolled up number to share with you. There may be a way for us to get it, but I don't have it at my disposal right now.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sue. Anyone else have any thoughts or questions? One of the things that Forrest and I were talking about before we started, again, I feel like Forrest's whole presentation was very hopeful and inspiring. But I was wondering, for you, Forrest, like what has been one of the more hopeful things that you've seen lately? Maybe a specific story or example, or just even an interaction that just felt really good.
Yeah. So we have family, my husband and I have family in Asheville, North Carolina, which is a great place to have family because you get out to the Blue Ridge Mountains and the Blue Ridge Parkway and see some really beautiful landscapes while also seeing family. And this isn't like the last couple months, but it was this year. We were out at the national park, and we were on the trail, and there was just a moment where I was like, gosh, the trail's so busy today. And this kind of reminds me of what we were just talking about, Sue. And I was like, it's almost like I'm pulling off to get out of people's way. And I'm like, I don't know if I'll see that many birds. And then I stopped and I heard like 3 different languages being spoken at the same time from people going up and down the trail. And then I had to smile. I was like, it is busy and it may not be like super quiet in this exact spot, but how amazing is it to be out here in the middle of a national park that is a destination for so many people, and to have people of all different ages, first of all, and then multiple languages just happening in the same space on this trail. And so that's my little nugget of inspiration, and naturally very people focused, but just being on the trail and hearing that. And it also in real time fights that stereotype we hear that people of different cultures don't appreciate nature or don't go outside, or they don't understand nature in the same way we do. Maybe they don't, but there's a lot of cultural appreciation and stewardship ethos in many different communities. And that was just one of those moments where I just had to I actually had to get out of my own head and being like, gosh, I need a little room to breathe, both because it was a steep trail and because it was busy, and just remember how kind of cool that was.
The opposite of the hopeful thing is, how are things going as things are kind of shifting at the federal level, with sort of the backing off from diversity and equity in all realms, how is that impacting your work at all, if at all?
Yeah, and Andrea, I saw you came off mute, so I'd love to hear from you in a second too, but I'll take Carrie's question first. And well, first of all, as an organization that works a lot on federal policy, and if we're going to call ourselves the voice of the land trust community, that means we have to actually do that work. And so we do that work with legislators all the time in different administrations. And so anytime an administration turns over, it's a ton of work for an organization like us to kind of restart that education process. Different administrations have different levels of familiarity with conservation and environmentalism in general. And then to get into the specifics of what we just talked about, private land conservation, the work of land trusts is a niche within the world of land conservation and environmentalism. And so we really, that 61 million acres is not a small chunk of change. We really want administrations to understand that impact and to understand what it takes to keep moving that work forward. And also to understand that it's not something we just do in a bubble. Like, it's not just like we slap some fences down and land is protected, that this is work that is done in partnership with landowners, with community members. And so I also think it's really important for us to convey the how, not just the what of our impact as land trusts and as the Land Trust Alliance. So that's been a lot of work. That's always a lot of work when the administration changes over. And that's probably even true at the state level for organizations that are more working at that level. We have, like many, experienced some challenges with just understanding where and when federal funding will be flowing, and will formerly steadfast sources of funding be available to our members, to conservation organizations, and to communities going forward. And we're still trying to help to understand that, to unpack that and understand what funding sources will be flowing to communities, to land trusts, and that work is ongoing. And I'll just say on the community commitment side of things, the Alliance for a long time has had people at the center of land conservation. One of the things we've been saying lately, which I think has been in everyone's mind, but we're finally just like saying it, is that people are the answer. And so for that to be true, we have to understand that different communities have had different relationships to land, have had different access to land, have been either prioritized or excluded to different degrees, depending on moments in history, depending on what part of the country you're talking about. And so all of that has to be part of the conversation. And so we're really committed to making sure that when we say that all communities need to benefit from land conservation, that we actually mean that we're unpacking what it means for Black, Indigenous, and people of color to still have those relationships and have those opportunities to own, to conserve, to steward, to be a part of land conservation. And so we're not shortening our commitments there. We're not changing our commitments there, but I do think the way that we navigate our partnerships and the time we need to spend with our partners has increased. We want to make sure that our partners understand we're still in this together, that we're tending to not just our needs, but the needs of communities and the needs of partners. And I think that's advice that I have for land trusts that are working at the ground level more than we are. So don't forget to check in with your community members and your community partners at this time. And I guess I did promise a little more advice to anyone, whether or not you're working at a land trust. And my big piece of advice that I've been carrying lately, that I'm trying to practice myself in work and personally, is just asking right now, what do you need? Because different communities have such different needs right now, and different people are experiencing this moment in history in different ways. And sometimes just asking that question, regardless of, you don't know what you're going to get back, right? You might have to actually respond to something pretty serious. You might have to like change the way you're doing something. But if we want to be community centered, if we want to prioritize equity in our work, we have to be asking that question regularly. And we have to be asking that question in this moment. What can we do to support you right now? And that's not just during this year or this administration. I mean, that is the heart of community centered conservation. It's being able to ask that question on an ongoing basis and to actually respond. So yeah, the work goes on. The work may be changing a little bit, but the work has always changed. And the name of the work has been different over the years. And I think what's most important is that the commitment is still there and that people are still working hard towards a better future.